exploring the dark realm of Mexican drug lords, the birth of a narco-state. Before the headlines, before the masked gunmen and burning convoys, before the whispered names that would one day echo across continents, there was silence. A different kind of silence. The kind that settles over forgotten roads, remote villages, and borderlands where the law arrives late. If it arrives at all, Mexico's descent into cartel dominance did not begin with violence. It began with opportunity. In the early 20th century, Mexico was a nation rebuilding itself from revolution. Its institutions were fragile, its borders vast and porous, its rural regions disconnected from the political center. In these spaces, far from Mexico City, far from accountability, power did not belong to the state. It belonged to whoever could enforce it. Smuggling was not yet a crime of terror. It was a trade. Alcohol during American Prohibition. Marijuana and opium harvested quietly in the mountains. The men who controlled these routes were not called drug lords. They were intermediaries, fixers, providers. But every illicit economy follows the same rule. Where demand grows, violence follows. By the 1970s, the United States' appetite for narcotics exploded. Cocaine flooded in from South America. Heroin, marijuana, later methamphetamine all required corridors. Mexico was no longer just a producer or a pass-through. It became the artery. And arteries must be controlled. What emerged was not a single organization, but a shadow ecosystem, cartels evolving like organisms under pressure. When one was cut down, another adapted. When enforcement increased, brutality escalated. Fear became currency. The Mexican state responded, but too late and too unevenly. Corruption seeped into every layer of enforcement. A police badge no longer guaranteed loyalty to the law, it merely signaled who paid better. Entire towns learned a new rule. Survival meant obedience. Those who spoke disappeared. Those who resisted were erased publicly. Violence was no longer a byproduct, it was communication. Bodies hanging from bridges, messages carved into skin, videos recorded not for profit, but for warning. This was not chaos. It was order, cartel order. By the time the world learned names like Sinaloa, Gulf, Juarez, and Zetas, the foundations were already laid. These were not gangs. They were parallel governments, complete with intelligence networks, taxation systems, armed forces, and international logistics. And unlike governments, they did not pretend to protect civilians. They ruled through certainty. Disobey and you will be seen. Children grew up understanding which streets were safe, which colors were forbidden, which words should never be spoken aloud. Journalists learned to self-censor or vanish. Politicians learned to cooperate or die. Mexico did not fall overnight. IT was slowly absorbed. What makes the Mexican drug lords different is not their wealth, nor their violence alone, but their integration into daily life. They were not hiding in jungles. They lived next door. They sponsored festivals. They paid for roads, churches, and funerals. Many communities abandoned by the state. The cartel was not the enemy. It was the only authority that showed up. This is the uncomfortable truth the world often avoids. The war on drugs was never just a war between criminals and police. It was a war over who governs. And in many regions, the answer was already decided. By the early 2000s, Mexico stood at a breaking point. The violence could no longer be hidden. What had once been whispered in border towns now erupted into national headlines. Beheadings, mass graves, entire police departments compromised. The cartels were no longer afraid of the state. They were challenging it, and the state responded with militarization. Soldiers deployed into cities, checkpoints erected overnight, armored vehicles rolling through neighborhoods that once knew only silence. But introducing the army into a corrupted system created a new monster. Soldiers defected. Elite units were recruited. Tactical knowledge fell into criminal hands. This is how Los Zetas were born, but that story comes later. For now, understand this. The dark realm of Mexican drug lords was not built by evil men alone. It was built by demand, neglect, corruption, and silence. And once it existed, it learned how to survive. Because in this world, fear is more reliable than loyalty. And violence is the most honest language of power. In the next part, we enter the invisible empire, the Sinaloa Cartel, and the man who proved that you don't need to be seen to rule the world. The invisible empire, Sinaloa Cartel, and the man who ruled without being seen. Power does not always announce itself with gunfire. Sometimes, it whispers. While rival cartels built their reputations on terror, on public executions, burning vehicles, and mutilated bodies, the Sinaloa Cartel perfected something far more dangerous: invisibility. For decades, it became the most powerful criminal organization in the Western Hemisphere, not by being the loudest, but by being the smartest. Its leader was not a mythic brute or a screaming warlord. He was a man who understood patience. His name was Joaquin Archivaldo Guzman Lora. The world would come to know him as El Chapo. But before the headlines, before the prison escapes, before the courtroom spectacle, El Chapo was simply another trafficker navigating the mountains of Sinaloa, a region where poverty was endemic, the state was distant, and smuggling was tradition. In these mountains, survival required adaptability. The terrain itself shaped the cartel's philosophy. Move quietly, build alliances, and never appear stronger than necessary. Sinaloa did not conquer territory through mass slaughter. It absorbed it. Unlike other cartels that ruled through fear alone, Sinaloa relied on networks. Corrupt officials, businessmen, transport companies, customs agents, politicians, and foreign partners. Violence was a last resort, not a signature. This made Sinaloa harder to fight, harder to map, and almost impossible to dismantle. The cartel did not operate like a gang. It operated like a multinational corporation. Routes were diversified. Leadership was decentralized. If one cell collapsed, another expanded. If a leader was arrested, operations continued uninterrupted. El Chapo himself embodied this philosophy. He avoided luxury displays. He avoided public appearances. He avoided the attention that destroyed others. While rivals filmed executions to spread fear, El Chapo invested in tunnels. Not metaphorical tunnels, real ones. Under border fences, under homes, under prisons. Tunnels represented Sinaloa's mindset: patient, technical, precise. A silent challenge to borders, laws, and authority. The cartel's expansion coincided with a shift in the global drug market. Cocaine from Colombia required reliable transit. Heroin production surged. Methamphetamine laboratories spread across rural Mexico. Sinaloa controlled them all, not through monopolization, but through mediation. It positioned itself as the cartel that allowed others to operate. So long as they paid, cooperated, and respected invisible boundaries, this created a paradox. Sinaloa became powerful by allowing others to exist. The Mexican government, however, could not ignore El Chapo forever. International pressure mounted. The United States labeled him one of the world's most dangerous criminals. In 1993, Guzman was arrested in Guatemala and extradited to Mexico. The state declared victory, but Sinaloa did not collapse. Because the cartel was never one man. In 2001, El Chapo escaped from a maximum security prison, hidden inside a laundry cart, according to official accounts. Whether through corruption, bribery, or deliberate negligence, the message was clear. The prison held him. The system did not. For the next 13 years, Guzman operated freely, coordinating shipments worth billions of dollars. Entire regions knew he was present, but no one saw him. Villagers spoke of him cautiously, not with fear, but with resignation. Some spoke of protection. Others spoke of order. This is where the myth becomes dangerous. In areas abandoned by the state, Sinaloa filled gaps. It funded infrastructure. It resolved disputes, punished thieves selectively. It created a parallel governance structure. But this order was conditional. Those who cooperated lived. Those who didn't vanished. And while Sinaloa avoided unnecessary spectacle, it was capable of extraordinary brutality when challenged. Mass killings still occurred. Rivals were still eliminated. Families still paid the price. The difference was efficiency. When violence was used, it was decisive and silent. By the time Guzman was captured again in 2014, the world watched closely. This time, authorities promised there would be no mistakes. In 2015, he escaped again, through a mile-long tunnel equipped with lighting, ventilation, and a motorcycle mounted on rails. The escape was humiliating, not just for Mexico, but for the idea of containment itself. How do you imprison a man whose real power exists outside his body? When El Chapo was finally extradited to the United States in 2017, many believed the Sinaloa Cartel would fracture. It didn't. Leadership shifted. Operations continued. Routes remained active. The machine adapted. This is the defining truth of Sinaloa. It was never dependent on fear alone, nor on one leader. It was a system built on cooperation, corruption, and strategic restraint. And that is why it survived longer than any rival. But survival does not mean peace. As Sinaloa expanded, it created enemies. Not just rival cartels, but factions within itself. Power vacuums formed. New leaders emerged, less patient, more violent. The era of invisible control began to erode. And as Sinaloa's influence stretched across continents, from Asia to Europe to Africa, the consequences grew heavier. More drugs, more deaths, more destabilization. The empire was invisible, but its impact was not. El Chapo now sits behind concrete walls in a foreign land, sentenced to life without parole. But the world he helped create continues to operate, evolve, and feed on demand. The lesson is uncomfortable. Removing a king does not end a kingdom built on profit. The Sinaloa Cartel proved that modern organized crime does not need chaos to thrive. It needs structure. And as long as demand exists, there will always be someone willing to rule quietly from the shadows. In the next part, we abandon invisibility and enter pure terror, where discipline replaced discretion, and fear became doctrine. This is the rise of Los Zetas. Los Zetas, military minds, absolute terror. If the Sinaloa Cartel represented silence and patience, Los Zetas represented something far more disturbing. They were not born from poverty. They were not shaped by desperation alone. They were trained. Los Zetas marked the moment when Mexico's drug war crossed a line, from organized crime into weaponized terror. Before them, cartel violence followed an unspoken logic. Brutality existed, but it served a purpose: intimidation, control, elimination. It was transactional. Los Zetas changed the equation. Violence became identity. Their origins trace back to the late 1990s, when the Gulf Cartel, one of Mexico's oldest trafficking organizations, made a strategic decision that would haunt the country for decades. Instead of recruiting street-level gunmen, the Gulf Cartel recruited elite soldiers. Members of Mexico's Grupo Aeromóvil de Fuerzas Especiales, GAEF, were among the most highly trained troops in Latin America. They were taught counterinsurgency, ambush tactics, intelligence gathering, psychological warfare. And they defected. Motivations varied: low pay, corruption, disillusionment, opportunity. But the result was unprecedented. For the first time, a cartel possessed a professional military unit. They called themselves Los Zetas, a radio code used by soldiers to identify high-ranking officers. From the beginning, they operated differently. They did not negotiate territory. They did not coexist. They invaded. Where other cartels sought cooperation, Los Zetas imposed domination. Towns were not absorbed, they were conquered. Local criminals were not partnered with, they were exterminated or forcibly recruited. Resistance was met with overwhelming force. Entire police departments were executed. Mass graves became common. Public displays of mutilation escalated rapidly. This was not impulsive violence. It was doctrine. Los Zetas understood something others did not. Fear spreads faster than bullets. Beheadings were filmed not as warnings, but as demonstrations. Victims were chosen strategically: journalists, migrants, activists, random civilians. Anyone could become an example. The message was simple and absolute: there are no non-combatants. This shattered long-standing boundaries. Previously, civilians were collateral. Under Los Zetas, civilians were leverage. Extortion became systematic. Entire economies were hijacked. Businesses paid protection fees or burned. Farmers paid to harvest their own land. Teachers paid to keep schools open. Even other cartels feared them. Los Zetas did not rely solely on drug trafficking. They diversified aggressively: kidnapping, oil theft, human trafficking, arms smuggling, piracy. They were not a cartel anymore. They were a criminal army. Their structure mirrored military hierarchy. Commanders controlled regions. Cells operated autonomously but followed centralized doctrine. Discipline was enforced brutally. Defection meant death. Unlike Sinaloa's subtlety, Los Zetas ruled through visibility. Their presence was meant to be felt constantly. Convoys rolled openly through towns. Armed men patrolled streets. Radio frequencies were monitored. Informants were everywhere. And unlike other groups, Los Zetas recruited indiscriminately. Former soldiers, police officers, gang members, teenagers, migrants forced at gunpoint. Training camps emerged deep in rural Mexico, where recruits learned not just to kill, but to terrorize. Survivors later described forced executions as initiation rituals. Hesitation was punished. Mercy was weakness. This culture of brutality accelerated fragmentation across Mexico. As Los Zetas expanded beyond the Gulf Cartel's control, they declared independence. What followed was one of the bloodiest periods in modern Mexican history. Entire states, Tamaulipas, Veracruz, Coahuila, descended into chaos. Towns were emptied. Roads became death corridors. Migrant routes turned into slaughter zones. One massacre stood out. San Fernando, Tamaulipas. Dozens of migrants, men, women, children, were abducted from buses and executed for refusing to work for the cartel. Their bodies were discovered months later in mass graves. It was a turning point. The world could no longer ignore what was happening. But terror has a weakness. It consumes itself. Los Zetas' extreme violence unified enemies. Rival cartels formed alliances. Communities organized self-defense militias. Government forces intensified operations. Internal fractures grew. Leadership disputes erupted. Discipline eroded. The very brutality that built their reputation destabilized their structure. By the mid-2010s, Los Zetas began to collapse into splinter groups, each more chaotic than the last. The most notorious successor was Cartel del Noteste, inheriting the Zeta legacy but lacking cohesion. Violence remained, but control weakened. Yet the damage was irreversible. Los Zetas permanently altered Mexico's criminal landscape. They proved that militarized terror could overwhelm regions faster than traditional trafficking. They erased the line between criminal and civilian space. And they introduced a new norm: spectacle as strategy. After Los Zetas, no cartel could afford restraint alone. Brutality escalated everywhere. Mexico's drug war was no longer about routes and profits alone. It became a war of psychological domination, and the civilian population, trapped between the state's weakness and the cartel's cruelty, paid the price. Los Zetas may be fractured today, but their influence persists in every video, every mass grave, every community that learned fear before law. They did not just kill people. They reshaped reality. In the next part, we descend deeper into the rituals, symbols, and messages that cartels use to rule the mind as much as the territory. Cartel rituals, fear, and control. How violence became a language. Violence alone does not sustain power. It must be understood. What separates the Mexican cartels from ordinary criminal organizations is not only how much violence they use, but how deliberately they communicate through it. Every act, every body, every symbol is chosen with intent. Nothing is random. Nothing is wasted. In cartel-controlled territory, violence is not chaos. It is messaging. To outsiders, the brutality appears irrational, excessive, grotesque, unnecessary. But within the cartel world, these acts form a grammar, a system of signs designed to replace law, courts, and institutions. Where the state speaks through legislation, cartels speak through fear. And fear, when structured correctly, becomes obedience. Public executions are rarely about the victim alone. They are about the audience. Bodies are placed where they will be seen: bridges, town squares, highways. The location matters as much as the act. A bridge is not chosen by accident. It represents passage, movement, connection. Hanging bodies from it transforms a neutral space into a warning. This road belongs to us. Messages are often left behind. Narcomantas, handwritten notes, banners draped over corpses. The words are direct, sometimes crude, sometimes poetic. Names are named. Threats are explicit. Apologies are occasionally offered, not to victims, but to the public. We had to do this. This framing is essential. Cartels do not want to be seen as monsters. They want to be seen as enforcers of order. The message is always the same. Violence is the consequence of disobedience. Ritualization reinforces this logic. Certain punishments are reserved for specific offenses. Informants are mutilated in ways that symbolize betrayal. Thieves are punished publicly to demonstrate that the cartel, not the police, protects property. Rival cartel members are executed in ways meant to humiliate their organization, not just kill their soldiers. Even silence is part of the ritual. Families are often forbidden from speaking, mourning publicly, or reporting disappearances. Grief itself becomes regulated. To cry too loudly is to invite attention. To ask questions is to imply defiance. This is how fear seeps into daily life. People learn what not to see, what not to hear, what not to remember. Over time, the extraordinary becomes routine. A burned car no longer shocks. Gunfire becomes background noise. Children learn the sound of automatic weapons before they learn geography. This normalization is not accidental. It is cultivated. Cartels also use symbols to reinforce identity and loyalty. Saints like Santa Muerte, the personification of death, are adopted not because of theology, but because of symbolism. Death is inevitable. Death is neutral. Death is powerful. Shrines appear in safe houses and rural compounds. Candles burn next to weapons. Prayers are whispered before executions. The ritual gives meaning to violence, transforming it from crime into destiny. For members, this creates psychological insulation. Killing is no longer a moral act, it is a function. Music plays a role as well. Narco-corridos, ballads glorifying traffickers, serve as oral history and propaganda. They immortalize leaders, battles, betrayals. They simplify complex realities into heroic narratives. But these songs are not just entertainment. They are instruction manuals. They teach who is powerful, who is feared, who deserves loyalty. To refuse to play certain songs in certain regions is dangerous. Music becomes territory. Cartels also control information through absence. Journalists are not censored, they are eliminated. Entire newsrooms practice self-censorship because survival depends on ignorance. What is not reported is often more important than what is. In some regions, people rely on whispers, social media warnings, and coded language to navigate danger. Messages spread quickly. Don't leave your house. Don't take that road. Don't go out tonight. The cartel does not need to issue official orders. Fear does the work for them. This psychological domination creates a paradox. While cartels terrorize communities, they also depend on them. Complete destruction would eliminate labor, silence networks, and disrupt operations. So violence is carefully balanced. Enough to terrify, not enough to empty everything. This balance is fragile. When it breaks, as it often does, the result is displacement. Entire towns abandon homes overnight. Schools close. Businesses shut down. Ghost communities appear across Mexico. These empty places are not abandoned because of war between cartels and the state. They are abandoned because civilians are no longer sure which rules apply. And uncertainty is more dangerous than fear. Cartels understand this. That is why they sometimes intervene to restore normalcy. They enforce curfews. They punish random violence. They issue apologies after public massacres, not out of compassion but necessity. The ultimate goal is predictability, that if people know the rules, they will follow them. If they believe violence is targeted, they will stay silent. This is how cartels maintain control without constant bloodshed. Yet beneath the structure lies constant tension. Younger recruits push for spectacle. Leaders push for discretion. Social media amplifies every act, eroding control over the narrative. Videos circulate beyond intended audiences. What was meant as a local warning becomes global evidence. The world watches, horrified. But within cartel territory, the effect is different. People stop looking, they lower their eyes, they change routes, they forget names. Memory itself becomes dangerous. This is the true cost of cartel rule, not just death, but the erosion of trust, speech, and collective identity. Communities fracture into individuals focused only on survival. And survival, in this world, means silence. Women, children, and the cost of silence. Life trapped between cartels and the state. Wars are usually measured in territory gained, leaders captured, enemies killed. But the true cost of Mexico's drug war is not written in numbers. It lives in kitchens where chairs remain empty, in classrooms that never reopen, in children who learn to stay quiet before they learn to read. For civilians, there is no front line because everywhere is the front line. Women and children occupy the most vulnerable space in cartel-controlled regions. They are not targets by strategy, yet they are targets by consequence. Their suffering is rarely intentional, but it is entirely predictable. And it is constant. For women, cartel dominance means living under overlapping threats. Sexual violence is not a tactic officially acknowledged by cartels, but it is tolerated, normalized, and rarely punished. Power without accountability always produces abuse. Young women disappear at alarming rates. Some are forced into relationships with cartel members. Others are trafficked across regions or borders. Many are never found. Disappearance becomes a bureaucratic nightmare. Reports are delayed. Files are lost. Authorities suggest victims ran away or were involved. Blame replaces investigation. Mothers begin searching alone. Across Mexico, informal networks of women form, madres buscadoras, armed not with weapons but with shovels, maps, and photographs. They search fields, deserts, abandoned buildings for mass graves. They dig because no one else will. Each discovery confirms what they already knew. Silence protects the perpetrators, not the victims. But searching is dangerous. Women who refuse silence are threatened. Some are killed. Others are forced to stop through intimidation. Justice becomes something to be feared rather than pursued. For children, the damage is quieter but deeper. They grow up surrounded by fear yet expected to behave normally. Schools teach curriculum while students memorize escape routes. Teachers are extorted. Some are killed for refusing to cooperate. Education becomes unstable. Attendance drops. entire generations lose access to consistency. And where education collapses, recruitment thrives. Cartels do not need to persuade children. They only need to offer structure, money, and belonging, things the state has failed to provide. For a teenager raised amid violence, joining a cartel can feel less like crime and more like inevitability. This is not radicalization. It is adaptation. Children raised under cartel rule internalize its logic. Violence becomes normalized. Authority becomes arbitrary. Trust becomes rare. Psychologists describe widespread trauma, anxiety, depression, emotional numbness. But access to mental health care is limited or non-existent in the regions most affected, so trauma becomes culture. Families learn to self-censor at home. Parents teach children not to ask questions, not to repeat what they hear, not to name names. Silence becomes inheritance. Migration is often the only escape. Entire families abandon homes overnight, leaving behind generations of history. They flee not only violence, but unpredictability. Yet migration carries its own dangers: cartel-controlled routes, exploitation, detention. Even when families reach safety, the war follows them psychologically. Survivors carry guilt. Why did they escape when others didn't? Why did they survive? There are no clean endings. The most painful reality is this: civilians are not simply caught in the crossfire. They are the terrain. Cartels depend on civilian compliance. The state depends on civilian patience. Both fail them. When the government deploys military forces, civilians often face increased risk. Raids trigger retaliation. Wrong addresses are targeted. Innocent people are mistaken for collaborators. Trust in institutions erodes further. In many regions, civilians no longer believe justice is possible. Crimes go unreported. Disappearances remain unresolved. Legal processes stretch for years without answers. This creates a cycle of resignation. People stop expecting protection. They stop demanding accountability. They focus on surviving the day. This is perhaps the greatest victory of cartel power. Not control through terror alone, but control through exhaustion. When people are too tired to resist, too afraid to speak, and too isolated to organize, domination becomes effortless. Yet resistance still exists. It appears in small acts. Teachers who keep classrooms open, journalists who publish anonymously, families who continue searching despite threats. These acts rarely make headlines, but they sustain dignity. Still, they come at a cost. Mexico's drug war has produced millions of invisible victims, not counted in official statistics, not memorialized, not compensated. Their stories are fragmented, whispered, unfinished. And as long as silence is safer than truth, their suffering will remain hidden. In the next part, we follow the threads upward, into the web of corruption that allows cartels to survive, thrive, and outlive every crackdown. The corruption web. Police, politicians, and the untouchables. Cartels do not survive because they are strong. They survive because the system around them is weak and profitable. For every gunman on the street, there are dozens of unseen collaborators operating behind desks, behind uniforms, behind titles. Without them, the cartel world would collapse under its own weight. Corruption is not a side effect of the Mexican drug war. It is its infrastructure. At the lowest level, it begins with necessity. A police officer earning a modest salary is offered more money in one envelope than he earns in months. Refusal is rarely neutral. It is interpreted as defiance, and defiance has consequences. Plata o plomo, silver or lead. This phrase is not a threat, it is a business proposition. Accept the bribe or accept the bullet. Over time, this choice ceases to feel like a choice at all. Police forces in cartel-dominated regions are not infiltrated overnight. They are absorbed gradually. One officer turns, then another. Soon, loyalty to the badge becomes secondary to loyalty to survival. Once compromised, institutions become tools. Police redirect patrols away from cartel convoys. Evidence disappears. Arrests target rivals instead of allies. Witnesses are warned before raids. Entire operations are leaked in advance. The line between law enforcement and organized crime blurs until it disappears at higher levels. Corruption becomes strategic. Municipal officials control permits, zoning, and contracts. Cartels fund campaigns quietly, ensuring friendly administrations. In return, businesses linked to laundering operations receive protection. Infrastructure projects are steered. Inspections are ignored. Politics becomes transactional. Some officials rationalize cooperation as harm reduction. Better to keep violence low. Better to negotiate than provoke. Others see only opportunity. Either way, accountability vanishes. Governors, mayors, legislators, some are bribed, some threatened, some willing participants. Investigations stall. Prosecutors are reassigned. Judges receive recommendations. Justice becomes selective. Those who expose corruption are isolated. Whistleblowers are silenced. Journalists investigating political cartel links face the highest risk. Mexico has become one of the most dangerous countries in the world for reporters, not because of war zones, but because truth disrupts profit. Even federal interventions struggle. When military forces are deployed, they enter environments where local intelligence is already compromised. Every move is anticipated. Every raid leaks. Soldiers, too, are vulnerable. Some defect. Others cooperate quietly. A few resist and pay the price. The corruption web is resilient because it is mutually beneficial. Cartels gain protection. Officials gain money and power. Businesses gain contracts. Communities gain temporary stability. Everyone gains except the public. This system does not require total corruption. It requires only enough to paralyze reform. A few compromised nodes can sabotage entire institutions. When arrests occur, they are often symbolic. Low-level operatives, disposable figures, rarely the architects. And when a high-ranking figure does fall, it is often because they lost protection, not because the system rejected them. This creates a culture of untouchability. Powerful figures operate openly, confident that consequences are negotiable. They attend public events. They run businesses. They present themselves as legitimate actors. Meanwhile, citizens learn a dangerous lesson. Law does not equal justice. This erodes civic trust faster than violence ever could. Why report a crime if the police are involved? Why testify if the court is compromised? Why vote if outcomes are prearranged? Apathy becomes survival. The international dimension deepens the problem. Money laundering flows through global financial systems, banks, shell companies, real estate markets. Illicit profits are sanitized abroad, beyond the reach of local accountability. Demand comes from outside. Weapons come from outside. Profits leave. Yet responsibility remains local. This imbalance fuels resentment and helplessness. Mexico fights a war fueled by foreign consumption, armed by foreign supply, and laundered through global institutions. The state is expected to win, but is structurally prevented from doing so. This is why crackdowns fail. Arresting traffickers does not dismantle the system that protects them. Killing leaders creates vacancies. Militarization without reform deepens corruption. The war becomes self-perpetuating. And as long as corruption remains cheaper than reform, cartels will outlive every strategy deployed against them. In the next part, we confront the uncomfortable truth behind all of this. Why the war cannot be won as it is currently fought. Why the war can't be won. Drugs, demand, and global complicity. Every war is defined not only by its weapons, but by its logic. And the logic of the war on drugs has been broken from the beginning. For decades, Governments have framed the conflict as a battle between good and evil, law versus crime, order versus chaos. But this narrative collapses under scrutiny because it ignores the engine that drives everything. Demand. As long as drugs are consumed, they will be produced. As long as they are produced, they will be trafficked. And as long as trafficking generates enormous profit, violence will follow. Mexico did not create the global drug market. It became its battlefield. The largest consumers of narcotics are not the communities destroyed by cartels. They are thousands of miles away in wealthy nations where addiction is treated as a health crisis, but its consequences are exported. This creates a moral imbalance. Mexico absorbs the bloodshed. Others absorb the product. The war on drugs assumes that supply can be eliminated through force. But history proves the opposite. Every major crackdown creates scarcity. Scarcity increases prices. Higher prices attract new actors. The market adapts faster than enforcement ever could. When Colombia intensified its war against cartels, trafficking routes shifted north. When Caribbean corridors closed, Mexico became essential. When leaders were captured, organizations fragmented, becoming more violent, not less. This is known as the balloon effect. Squeeze one area, and the pressure moves elsewhere. The war does not end. It relocates. Militarization compounds the problem. Soldiers are trained to defeat enemies, not govern communities. Their presence escalates conflict dynamics. Cartels respond with heavier weapons, better tactics, and greater brutality. The result is an arms race with no finish line. Meanwhile, the financial core of the drug trade remains largely untouched. Profits are laundered through international banks, shell corporations, luxury real estate, cryptocurrency networks, and global supply chains. The money rarely stays where the violence occurs. This disconnect is crucial. You cannot defeat a business by attacking its labor while protecting its profits. Yet this is exactly what the global strategy has done. Low-level traffickers are arrested. Mid-level leaders are killed. Entire regions are militarized. But the financial architects, the ones who integrate illicit money into legal economies, remain insulated. This is not a failure of intelligence. It is a failure of political will. Criminal economies intersect with legitimate ones too deeply. Real estate markets benefit. Construction booms. Local economies stabilize temporarily. Politicians avoid uncomfortable reforms. The war becomes something to manage, not resolve. Legalization debates highlight this contradiction. Some drugs are decriminalized in consumer nations, reducing penalties at home, while production zones remain criminalized abroad. The message is implicit: harm is acceptable as long as it happens elsewhere. This deepens resentment and cynicism in countries like Mexico, where citizens watch their communities destroyed to sustain habits that others discuss abstractly. The war on drugs also misunderstands violence. Violence is not a deviation from the system. It is a feature of prohibition markets. When disputes cannot be resolved legally, they are resolved violently. When contracts are unenforceable, fear enforces them. Remove the legal framework, and violence becomes governance. Cartels do not thrive despite prohibition. They thrive because of it. This does not mean legalization is a simple solution. Organized crime adapts. It diversifies. It moves into extortion, trafficking, and exploitation. But it does mean that the current strategy guarantees failure. The war cannot be won because it is not designed to end. It sustains institutions. It justifies budgets. It produces headlines. But it does not dismantle incentives. For civilians, this realization is devastating. It means waiting for victory is pointless. It means the future will resemble the present, managed instability rather than peace. Yet acknowledging failure is the first step toward change. A different approach would require confronting demand honestly, regulating markets responsibly, dismantling financial networks aggressively, and rebuilding institutions from the ground up. These steps are politically difficult. They require cooperation, transparency, and long-term investment. Violence is cheaper to us, so the war continues, not because it works, but because stopping it would require courage across borders. And courage, unlike profit, is in short supply. In the final part, we look beyond the violence to what remains when cartels fall, fragment, or fade. After the blood, what remains when cartels collapse? When a cartel falls, the world expects relief. Headlines speak of victories. Arrests are announced. Leaders are paraded before cameras. Governments declare progress. But on the ground, the question is different. What actually changes? In regions where cartels once ruled absolutely, their collapse rarely brings peace. It brings uncertainty. Cartels do not disappear cleanly. They fragment. Lieutenants break away. Cells compete. Former allies become enemies. The violence does not end, it multiplies, becoming less predictable and more localized. Where there was one authority, there are now many. This is the aftermath most civilians fear. Under a dominant cartel, rules, however brutal, were at least known. After collapse, rules vanish. Kidnappings spike. Extortion becomes decentralized. Random violence increases. Communities experience a dangerous vacuum. The state often arrives late, unprepared to replace what, however illegitimate, had functioned as governance. Police forces remain compromised. Courts remain slow. Trust remains broken. So people adapt again. Some form self-defense groups. Others negotiate with emerging factions. Many leave. Cartel collapse accelerates displacement. Ghost towns expand. Abandoned homes rot. Infrastructure decays. The social fabric, already fragile, tears further. Children raised amid collapse inherit instability rather than terror. But instability carries its own trauma. Unpredictability, insecurity, and chronic anxiety. Former cartel members face limited options. Few can reintegrate into society. Skills learned in violence do not translate easily into civilian life. Some disappear. Some rejoin new groups. Some become predators outside formal structures. Rehabilitation is rare. Stigma is permanent. The long-term damage becomes generational. Economically, regions struggle to recover. Illicit economies had provided income, however immoral or dangerous. When they vanish, nothing replaces them quickly. Legitimate investment avoids instability. Jobs disappear. Poverty deepens. This is where the cycle threatens to restart. Where there is desperation, there is recruitment. Where there is abandonment, there is opportunity. New groups emerge, not identical to the old ones, but shaped by the same conditions. This is why cartel collapse does not equal resolution. True recovery requires something far harder than arrests or military deployments. It requires reconstruction. Not just of infrastructure, but of trust. Schools must reopen safely. Courts must function visibly. Police must protect without extortion. Journalists must report without fear. Victims must be acknowledged, not ignored. Memory must be preserved. Mass graves must be documented. Disappearances named. Responsibility traced not only to gunmen, but to systems that enabled them. Without memory, collapse becomes denial. Without justice, recovery becomes illusion. There are places where progress has begun, slowly, unevenly. Communities reclaim space. Youth programs interrupt recruitment. Transparency initiatives expose corruption. Survivors organize. These efforts rarely make headlines. They are quiet, fragile, vulnerable, but they are real. The dark realm of Mexican drug lords was not created by monsters alone. It was created by global demand, political neglect, corruption, and silence, and it will not disappear through force alone. The future depends on whether societies are willing to confront uncomfortable truths, that prohibition creates violence, that consumption has consequences, that ignoring suffering does not contain it. Cartels thrive in shadows. Recovery requires light, not spectacle, not slogans, but sustained attention. When the blood dries, what remains is choice. Repeat the cycle, or break. History suggests how difficult that choice is, but it also shows something else. Even in the darkest systems, collapse creates space. And in that space, however small, lies the possibility, fragile, uncertain, unfinished, of something better.